The snow fell in thick, relentless sheets across the mountain pass as Sarah Ross pressed her back against the rough bark of a towering pine, her breath coming in ragged gasps that formed small clouds in the frigid air. Her hands trembled as they cradled her swollen belly, the baby within her stirring restlessly as if sensing the danger that lurked in the shadows of the forest. The wind howled through the branches above, carrying with it the distant sound of voices, harsh and determined, growing closer with each passing moment. "Please," she whispered into the darkness, her voice barely audible above the storm. "Please let someone find us before they do." Her fingers traced the worn fabric of her coat, feeling the sharp edges of the letter hidden in the inner pocket. The letter that contained a truth so devastating it had driven her from everything she had ever known. The baby kicked against her ribs and she winced, placing both hands over the spot where tiny feet pressed against her skin. Through the swirling snow, she could make out the flickering glow of torches in the distance, their bearers moving with the methodical precision of hunters tracking wounded prey. Her heart hammered against her chest as she realized how little time she had left. The cabin she had been seeking, the one the old woman in the last settlement had told her about, remained nowhere to be seen. All around her stretched an endless expanse of white, broken only by the dark silhouettes of evergreens that stood like silent sentinels in the night. The voices grew louder now, close enough that she could make out individual words carried on the wind. They spoke of her with a mixture of anger and determination that made her blood run cold. These were not men who would show mercy to a woman in her condition, not when so much was at stake. The truth she carried was worth more than her life to them, worth more than the innocent child she sheltered within her womb. A branch snapped somewhere behind her, and Sarah's eyes flew wide with terror. She pressed herself harder against the tree, willing herself to become invisible, to disappear into the bark and snow until the danger passed. But even as she held her breath, she knew it was futile. They would find her eventually, and when they did, neither she nor her child would live to see another dawn. That was when she saw him, emerging from the storm like a figure from a dream or perhaps a nightmare. He moved through the snow with the fluid grace of someone who belonged to these mountains, his long coat billowing behind him as he approached her hiding place. In his hands he carried a rifle, its barrel gleaming dully in the reflected light of the distant torches. And for a moment Sarah was certain that her pursuers had finally caught up with her. But as he drew closer, she saw something in his weathered face that gave her pause. There was no malice in his dark eyes, no cruel satisfaction at having cornered his quarry. Instead, she glimpsed something that looked almost like concern, a gentleness that seemed at odds with his imposing presence. He stopped just a few feet away from her, his gaze taking in her condition with a single assessing glance. "Ma'am," he said quietly, his voice barely rising above the wind, "you shouldn't be out here in your condition. This storm's only going to get worse." He glanced toward the approaching torches, his jaw tightening with what might have been anger or determination. "And it looks like you've got bigger problems than the weather." Sarah's hand instinctively moved to the letter in her pocket, her fingers closing around the folded paper that had already cost her everything. She studied the stranger's face, searching for any sign of deception or hidden agenda, but found only a steady calm that spoke of a man accustomed to making life and death decisions in the span of a heartbeat. Behind him, the torches continued their relentless advance, and she realized that whatever his intentions, he represented her only chance of survival. "Help me," she whispered, the words torn from her throat by desperation and the last remnants of hope. "Please, I'm begging you. They want to kill me and my baby." Her voice broke on the last word, and she felt tears freezing on her cheeks as they fell. "I have nowhere else to go." The mountain man's expression hardened as he looked past her toward the approaching lights, his grip shifting on his rifle. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of a man who had made his decision and would see it through to the end, regardless of the cost. "Then we'd better get you somewhere safe," he said simply, extending his free hand toward her. "My name's Kyle Diaz, and I give you my word that no harm will come to you or your child while you're under my protection." 3 weeks earlier, Sarah Ross had stood in the parlor of the finest house in Millfield, her hands folded neatly in front of her as she listened to words that would forever change the course of her life. The room was warm and elegantly appointed, its walls lined with books and paintings that spoke of wealth and refinement. A fire crackled merrily in the hearth, casting dancing shadows across the Persian rug that covered the polished hardwood floor. "I'm afraid there's been a terrible mistake, my dear," said the elderly gentleman seated behind the mahogany desk, his voice carrying the measured tones of someone accustomed to delivering difficult news. Judge Thomas Edwards had been a fixture in the community for as long as anyone could remember, his reputation for fairness and integrity beyond reproach. But as Sarah looked into his kind eyes, she saw something that made her stomach clench with dread. "I don't understand, Your Honor," she replied, her voice steady despite the turmoil building in her chest. "What kind of mistake?" She had come to his home at his urgent request, leaving her small apartment above the seamstress shop where she had been working to support herself during her pregnancy. The judge had been a friend of her late husband's family, and she had hoped he might have news about the modest inheritance that had been promised to her. Judge Edwards removed his spectacles and cleaned them with deliberate care, buying himself time before delivering the blow that would shatter her world. "It concerns your late husband's estate, Sarah. I'm afraid the documents we've been working from were not entirely accurate." He replaced his glasses and opened a leather portfolio that sat on his desk, revealing a stack of official papers covered in legal script. "What do you mean?" Sarah's hand moved instinctively to her belly, where her child rested peacefully, unaware of the storm that was about to break over their lives. She had been counting on the inheritance to see her through the difficult months ahead, to provide for her baby when it arrived. Without it, she had nothing but the few dollars she had managed to save from her work at the shop. "Your husband, God rest his soul, was not the man we all believed him to be," the judge said gently, his eyes filled with genuine sympathy. "The name he gave you, the family he claimed to belong to, the fortune he promised would be yours. None of it was real, my dear. James Ross was not his true name, and the family whose inheritance you were expecting to receive has never heard of either of you." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow, driving the air from her lungs and leaving her gasping for breath. She gripped the arms of her chair, her knuckles white with the strain of trying to process what she was hearing. "That's impossible," she whispered. "James was a good man. He loved me. He would never have lied about something so important." Judge Edwards leaned forward, his expression grave. "I'm afraid there's more, Sarah. Much more." He withdrew a single sheet of paper from the portfolio and held it out to her with trembling fingers. "This arrived by special courier this morning. It's from the Territorial Marshal's office in Denver." Sarah took the document with hands that shook so violently she could barely hold it steady enough to read. As her eyes moved across the page, taking in the official seals and formal language, she felt her world crumbling around her. The paper detailed crimes that spanned years and multiple territories: robbery, fraud, and worse. At the bottom of the page, in stark black ink, was a name she recognized all too well. James William Morrison, wanted dead or alive for his crimes against the people of Colorado Territory. "No," she breathed, the paper fluttering to the floor as her hands flew to cover her mouth. "This can't be true. James was killed in a mining accident. Everyone said so. The whole town mourned him." "I'm afraid the mining accident was staged, my dear," Judge Edwards said softly. "According to this report, your husband faked his own death to escape the law. But it appears his past has finally caught up with him. He was found dead 3 days ago in a saloon in Denver, shot down by a bounty hunter who recognized him despite his changed appearance." Sarah doubled over in her chair, her body racked with sobs that seemed to tear her apart from the inside. Everything she had believed about her life, about the man she had loved and married, crumbled to dust in the space of a few minutes. The baby stirred within her, responding to her distress, and she realized with growing horror that she was carrying the child of a criminal, a man who had built their entire relationship on lies and deception. "There's something else," Judge Edwards continued, his voice heavy with reluctance. "The marshal's report indicates that James may have hidden stolen money somewhere before his supposed death. There are men looking for it, dangerous men who believe you might know where it is." He stood and moved around the desk to kneel beside her chair, his weathered hand resting gently on her shoulder. "Sarah, you're in grave danger. These men won't hesitate to hurt you or your child if they think you're keeping information from them." Through her tears, Sarah looked up at the judge's kind face and saw the truth written there. She was alone in the world, pregnant with the child of a dead criminal and hunted by men who would kill her without a second thought. The comfortable life she had imagined for herself and her baby had vanished like smoke, leaving behind only fear and uncertainty. "What am I supposed to do?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know anything about stolen money. James never told me anything about his past. How can I convince them of something I don't even understand myself?" Judge Edwards helped her to her feet, his expression grim but determined. "You need to leave Millfield tonight, Sarah. I have friends in other territories who might be able to help you start over. But first, you need to get as far away from here as possible." He pressed a small leather pouch into her hands, and she could feel the weight of coins within it. "This isn't much, but it should be enough to get you started. Head west, toward the mountains. There are settlements there where a woman can disappear if she needs to." As Sarah clutched the pouch to her chest, she felt the last vestiges of her old life slipping away. The woman who had awakened that morning believing herself to be the widow of a respectable man was gone forever, replaced by a fugitive carrying the child of a criminal. But even as despair threatened to overwhelm her, she felt a fierce protectiveness rise within her. Whatever James had done, whatever sins he had committed, their child was innocent. She would do whatever it took to protect the life growing within her, even if it meant leaving everything she had ever known behind. "Thank you," she whispered to Judge Edwards, knowing that his kindness might be the last she would encounter for a very long time. "I won't forget what you've done for me." That night, as the town of Millfield slept peacefully under a blanket of early winter snow, Sarah Ross gathered her few possessions and slipped away into the darkness, beginning a journey that would test every ounce of strength and courage she possessed. The wagon lurched violently as its wheels hit another rut in the frozen road, jarring Sarah from the uneasy doze she had fallen into despite her best efforts to remain alert. She gripped the side of the rough wooden seat, her other hand instinctively protecting her belly as the vehicle swayed dangerously from side to side. The driver, a grizzled old man named Stephen Kelly, who had agreed to take her as far as the mountain settlements for the last of her precious coins, muttered a string of curses under his breath as he fought to control his struggling horses. "Storm's coming in faster than I thought," he called back to her over the howling wind. "We might have to stop and wait it out if it gets much worse." His weathered face was nearly hidden beneath a thick wool scarf, but Sarah could see the concern in his eyes as he scanned the darkening sky above them. Sarah pulled her thin coat tighter around her shoulders, wishing she had been able to afford something warmer before beginning this journey. The past 2 weeks had been a blur of cold nights spent in cheap boarding houses and long days traveling in whatever conveyance she could find, always looking over her shoulder for signs of pursuit. The money Judge Edwards had given her was nearly gone, spent on passage and the meager meals she had been able to afford along the way. "How much farther to the next settlement?" she asked, raising her voice to be heard above the wind. The baby had been unusually active all day, as if sensing her anxiety and responding to it with restless movements that left her breathless and uncomfortable. She pressed her hand against her side where a tiny foot seemed to be lodged beneath her ribs, trying to encourage the child to shift position. "Another hour, maybe 2 if this weather keeps up," Stephen replied, his attention focused on the treacherous road ahead. "There's a trading post up ahead where we can rest the horses and get some hot food. After that, it's just a short haul to Pine Ridge, assuming the pass doesn't get snowed in." Sarah nodded, though she knew the old man couldn't see her from his position on the driver's seat. Pine Ridge was supposed to be her destination, a small community nestled high in the mountains, where she hoped to find work and perhaps a measure of safety. The woman who had told her about it, a kind soul she had met at a way station 3 days earlier, had assured her that the people there minded their own business and didn't ask too many questions about a person's past. But as the wagon continued its slow progress through the increasingly heavy snowfall, Sarah began to worry that she might not make it to Pine Ridge at all. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and she could see ice forming on the horses' manes despite their constant movement. Her own fingers were numb with cold, and she found herself shivering uncontrollably despite her efforts to stay warm. "There," Stephen said suddenly, pointing ahead to where a faint glow was visible through the swirling snow. "That'll be Murphy's place. We can warm up there and decide whether to push on or wait for the storm to pass." The trading post turned out to be a low, rambling building constructed of rough-hewn logs, with smoke rising from its chimney in a steady stream that spoke of warmth and shelter. As Stephen guided the wagon into the yard, Sarah could see other travelers who had been caught by the storm. Their vehicles clustered around the building like ships seeking harbor in a tempest. Inside, the trading post was warm and crowded, filled with the mingled scents of wood smoke, coffee, and the hearty stew that bubbled in a large pot over the fire. Sarah found a seat at a small table near the back of the room, grateful to be out of the wind and snow. She ordered a bowl of stew and a cup of coffee, spending some of her dwindling funds on the luxury of a hot meal. As she ate, she became aware of the conversations taking place around her. Most of the talk centered on the weather and the condition of the roads, but she noticed that several men at a table near the door were discussing something in low, urgent tones. Every so often, one of them would glance in her direction, and Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature outside. "Excuse me, miss," said a voice beside her, and Sarah looked up to see a well-dressed man with cold eyes and a smile that never reached them. "I couldn't help but notice you're traveling alone. That's mighty dangerous for a lady in your condition, especially with this storm coming in." Sarah's hand moved instinctively to the letter hidden in her coat pocket, the document that Judge Edwards had given her, along with his warning about the men who might be looking for her. "I'm fine. Thank you," she replied, keeping her voice steady despite the fear that was building in her chest. "I'm expected in Pine Ridge, and I don't want to keep my friends waiting." The man's smile widened, but his eyes remained cold and calculating. "Pine Ridge, you say? That's a long way from here, especially for someone traveling alone. My associates and I are heading in that direction ourselves. Perhaps we could offer you protection on the road." "That's very kind of you, but I already have transportation," Sarah said, nodding toward where Stephen Kelly was warming himself by the fire. She could see the old driver watching the exchange with growing concern, his weathered hand resting casually near the knife at his belt. "I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding," the man said, his voice taking on a harder edge. "You see, we have reason to believe you might have information that belongs to us. Information about a mutual acquaintance who recently passed away under unfortunate circumstances." Sarah's blood turned to ice as she realized that her worst fears had come to pass. These men were the ones Judge Edwards had warned her about, the dangerous individuals who believed she knew something about James's hidden treasure. She could see others in the room beginning to take notice of the conversation, their faces reflecting curiosity and concern in equal measure. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, rising from her chair with as much dignity as she could muster. "I think there's been some mistake." The man's hand shot out and gripped her wrist with painful force, his fingers digging into her skin as he pulled her back down into her seat. "I don't think so, Mrs. Ross, or should I say, Mrs. Morrison. We know exactly who you are and what your dear departed husband told you before he staged his own death." Around the room, conversations had stopped as people turned to watch the unfolding drama. Sarah could see Stephen Kelly moving toward their table, his face dark with anger, but she also noticed that two other men had positioned themselves between the old driver and where she sat. The trap was closing around her, and she realized with growing desperation that she had nowhere to run. "Please," she whispered, her free hand moving to protect her belly. "I'm telling you the truth. I don't know anything about stolen money or hidden treasure. James never told me anything about his past." The man leaned closer, his breath hot against her ear as he spoke in tones that only she could hear. "Maybe you're telling the truth, and maybe you're not. But either way, you're coming with us. We have ways of making people remember things they thought they'd forgotten." Before Sarah could respond, the door of the trading post burst open with such force that it slammed against the wall, sending a shower of snow and frigid air swirling through the warm interior. Every head in the room turned toward the entrance as a figure stepped through the doorway, his long coat dripping with melted snow and his dark eyes taking in the scene with a single, comprehensive glance. Kyle Diaz moved through the crowded room with the fluid confidence of a man who was comfortable in any situation, no matter how dangerous. His weathered hands hung loose at his sides, but Sarah could see the way his fingers flexed slightly, ready to reach for the weapons she was certain he carried beneath his coat. When his gaze fell on her and the man who still gripped her wrist, his expression hardened into something that made even the hardened criminals take notice. "Evening, folks," Kyle said, his voice carrying easily through the sudden silence that had fallen over the room. "Looks like quite a storm blowing in out there." He approached their table with measured steps, his eyes never leaving the man who held Sarah captive. "I couldn't help but notice this lady seems to be in some distress. Is there a problem here?" The man holding Sarah's wrist straightened in his chair, his other hand moving to rest on the butt of the pistol at his hip. "No problem at all, friend. Just having a conversation with an old acquaintance. Nothing that concerns you." Kyle's smile was cold and dangerous, like the edge of a blade catching moonlight. "Well, that's where you're wrong, I'm afraid. You see, anytime a man lays hands on a pregnant woman in my presence, it becomes very much my concern." He pulled out a chair from an adjacent table and sat down, positioning himself so that he could see everyone in the room while keeping his attention focused on the immediate threat. "Look, mister," said one of the other men, rising from his seat near the door. "This ain't none of your business. The lady owes us something, and we aim to collect." "Is that so?" Kyle asked, his tone conversational, despite the tension that crackled through the air like electricity before a lightning strike. "And what exactly does a pregnant woman owe a group of armed men? Must be something pretty valuable to bring you out in weather like this." Sarah felt the grip on her wrist loosen slightly as her captor's attention was divided between her and this unexpected newcomer. She could see the wheels turning in his mind as he tried to assess whether Kyle represented a genuine threat or merely an inconvenience to be brushed aside. The other patrons of the trading post had begun to edge away from their table, sensing that violence might erupt at any moment. "Her husband stole something that belongs to us," the man said finally, apparently deciding that some explanation was necessary. "We have reason to believe she knows where he hid it before he died." Kyle's expression didn't change, but Sarah caught a subtle shift in his posture that suggested he was preparing for action. "And you thought the best way to get this information was to threaten a woman who's clearly with child? That strikes me as the behavior of cowards rather than men." The insult hung in the air like a challenge, and Sarah could see the fury building in her captor's face. His grip on her wrist tightened painfully, and she bit back a cry of distress as his fingers dug into her skin. Around the room, she could hear the subtle sounds of chairs scraping against the floor as people positioned themselves for whatever was about to happen. "You've got a big mouth for a man who's outnumbered 3-1, the leader snarled, his composure finally cracking under the pressure of Kyle's steady gaze. "Maybe you should mind your own business before you get hurt." 3-1? Kyle mused, glancing around the room with apparent interest. "Let me see now." His eyes settled on Stephen Kelly, who had managed to work his way closer to their table despite the men trying to block his path. "Steve there makes it 3-2, which are much better odds. And then there's Murphy behind the bar, who I notice has his shotgun within easy reach. That makes it 3-3, assuming Murphy doesn't mind a little excitement in his establishment." The proprietor of the trading post, a burly man with arms like tree trunks, nodded grimly as he reached beneath the bar. "I don't take kindly to folks threatening pregnant women in my place," he said, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had dealt with troublemakers before. "Seems to me you boys might want to reconsider your approach." Sarah felt a surge of hope as she realized that the balance of power in the room was shifting. The men who had seemed so confident and threatening just moments before now found themselves outnumbered and facing opponents who were clearly not intimidated by their reputation or their weapons. But she also knew that cornered animals were often the most dangerous, and she could see the desperation building in her captor's eyes. "This isn't over," the man hissed, finally releasing her wrist and rising from his chair. "We know who you are, Mrs. Morrison, and we know you're lying about that money. You can't run forever." "Maybe not," Kyle said quietly, standing as well and positioning himself between Sarah and the three men. "But she won't have to run alone." His hand moved to rest on the grip of his pistol, a gesture that was both casual and unmistakably threatening. "And if I were you, I'd think real careful about following her any further into these mountains. The weather's not the only thing that can be deadly up here." The leader of the group stared at Kyle for a long moment, clearly weighing his options. Finally, he jerked his head toward his companions, and the three men began moving toward the door. "This isn't finished," he called back over his shoulder. "Not by a long shot." As the door slammed shut behind them, the tension in the room began to dissipate, though Sarah could still feel her heart hammering against her ribs. She looked up at Kyle, this stranger who had appeared like an answer to her desperate prayers, and felt tears of gratitude burning in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the crackling of the fire. "I don't know how to repay you for what you just did." Kyle settled back into his chair, his expression gentling as he took in her obvious distress. "No need for thanks, ma'am. Any decent man would have done the same." He studied her face with eyes that seemed to see far more than she was comfortable revealing. "Though I get the feeling those boys weren't entirely wrong about you being in trouble. The question is, what kind of trouble? And how can we get you out of it?" Sarah wrapped her hands around the warm cup of coffee that Murphy had brought her, using the heat to chase away the chill that seemed to have settled deep in her bones. The trading post had returned to its normal bustle of activity, but she remained acutely aware of the curious glances being cast in her direction. Kyle Diaz sat across from her, his presence both comforting and unsettling in equal measure. "I suppose I owe you some explanation," she began, her voice barely rising above the general murmur of conversation around them. "Though I'm not sure you'll believe what I have to tell you." Kyle leaned back in his chair, his dark eyes studying her with an intensity that made her feel as though he could see straight through to her soul. "Try me," he said simply. "I've heard stranger stories than whatever you're carrying around." Sarah took a shaky breath, trying to organize her thoughts into something resembling coherence. "3 weeks ago, I thought I was the widow of a good man, expecting his child and looking forward to a comfortable life on the inheritance he had promised me." She paused, her hand moving instinctively to her belly where the baby rested quietly for the moment. "Then I discovered that everything I believed about my husband was a lie." She told him about the visit to Judge Edwards, about the marshal's report that had shattered her world, about the revelation that the man she had loved and married was a criminal who had built their entire relationship on deception. Kyle listened without interruption, his expression growing more grave with each detail she revealed. "The judge gave me this," she said, reaching into her coat pocket to withdraw the folded letter. "It's a copy of the marshal's report about James's crimes and his death. He said it might help me prove my innocence if those men caught up with me. But I'm beginning to think nothing will convince them that I don't know about any stolen money." Kyle took the document and read it carefully, his weathered features betraying no emotion as he absorbed the information. When he finished, he folded the paper and handed it back to her with gentle care. "This is a heavy burden for anyone to carry," he said quietly, "but especially for a woman in your condition." "I don't know what to do," Sarah admitted, the words tumbling out of her in a rush of desperation and fear. "I can't go back to Millfield, and those men will never stop looking for me as long as they believe I have information about James's stolen money. I thought I could disappear in Pine Ridge, start over with a new name and a new life, but they found me anyway." Kyle was quiet for a long moment, his gaze shifting to the window where snow continued to fall in thick, heavy flakes. "Pine Ridge isn't the place for you," he said finally. "It's too close to the main roads, too easy for men like that to find you again. But there are other places in these mountains, places where a person can disappear if they know where to look." "You mean you'll help me?" Sarah asked, hardly daring to hope that this stranger might be willing to risk his own safety for someone he had just met. "Those men won't give up easily," Kyle continued, as if she hadn't spoken. "They've invested too much time and effort in tracking you down to walk away empty-handed. And winter in these mountains can be just as deadly as any bullet if you're not prepared for it." Sarah felt her heart sink as she realized he was trying to let her down gently to explain why he couldn't possibly involve himself in her troubles. She had been foolish to think that one act of kindness meant he would be willing to take on the responsibility of protecting her and her unborn child. But then Kyle's eyes met hers, and she saw something in their depths that made her breath catch in her throat. "There's a place I know," he said quietly, "a cabin up in the high country where you could wait out the winter safely. It's isolated, well-stocked, and defensible if it comes to that, but the journey there won't be easy, especially in your condition." "You're offering to take me there?" Sarah asked, her voice filled with wonder and disbelief. Kyle nodded slowly, though his expression remained serious. "I am, But I need you to understand what you'd be agreeing to. The cabin is a full day's ride from here in good weather, and this storm is only going to make the journey more dangerous. Once we're there, we'll be snowed in until spring, with no way to get word to the outside world and no hope of rescue if something goes wrong. Sarah considered his words, weighing the risks against the alternatives. She could try to continue on to Pine Ridge, but those men would be watching for her there. She could attempt to find another route out of the mountains, but she had neither the money nor the knowledge to make such a journey on her own. Or she could trust this stranger who had already risked his own safety to protect her. "Why would you do this for me?" she asked, needing to understand his motivations before she could make such a momentous decision. "You don't even know me." Kyle was quiet for so long that Sarah began to think he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight of old pain that made her heart ache in sympathy. "I had a sister once," he said simply. "She found herself in trouble, pregnant and alone with nowhere to turn. I wasn't there when she needed me, and she died because of it. Maybe helping you won't change what happened to her, but it might help me sleep better at night." The simple honesty of his words moved Sarah more than any flowery speech could have. She could see the genuine pain in his eyes, the regret that had shaped him into the kind of man who would risk everything for a stranger in need. In that moment, she knew that she could trust him with her life and the life of her child. "All right," she said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of the decision she was making. "I'll go with you to this cabin, but I want you to know that I meant what I said before. I truly don't know anything about any stolen money. If those men follow us and find us there, it won't be because I've been lying to you." Kyle's expression softened slightly, and for the first time since he had entered the trading post, she saw him smile. "I believe you," he said, "and even if I didn't, it wouldn't change my decision. Every person deserves a chance to start over, to build something better than what they're running from." Outside, the storm continued to rage, but Sarah felt a warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with the fire crackling in the hearth. For the first time in weeks, she had hope that she and her child might survive the trials that lay ahead. The journey to Kyle's cabin began before dawn, when the storm had finally exhausted itself and left the world transformed beneath a blanket of pristine snow. Sarah had spent the night in a small room above the trading post, her sleep fitful and interrupted by the baby's restless movements and her own anxious thoughts about what lay ahead. When Kyle knocked softly on her door, she was already dressed and ready to face whatever the day might bring. "The weather's cleared for now," he said as she gathered her few possessions, "but there's another storm system moving in from the west. If we're going to make it to the cabin, we need to leave now." Sarah nodded, pulling her thin coat tighter around her shoulders as they made their way down to the stable where Kyle had prepared 2 horses for the journey. One was a sturdy mountain pony that he assured her was gentle and sure-footed, while the other was a larger animal that carried their supplies and provisions for the long winter ahead. "Are you sure you're up for this?" Kyle asked as he helped her mount her horse, his hands steady and reassuring as he adjusted her stirrups. "It's not too late to change your mind. We could find another way, maybe get you on a stage heading south." Sarah settled herself in the saddle, grateful for the thick blankets Kyle had provided to keep her warm during the ride. "Those men will be watching the stage routes," she said, "and besides, I've made my choice. I trust you to get us there safely." They rode out of the trading post yard as the first pale light of dawn began to filter through the clouds, their horses' hooves making soft crunching sounds in the fresh snow. The world around them was silent and beautiful, transformed by the storm into something that looked like a fairy tale kingdom. But Sarah was acutely aware of the dangers that lurked beneath the pristine surface, both from the harsh environment and from the men who might even now be planning their pursuit. As they climbed higher into the mountains, the air grew thinner and colder, making each breath visible in small puffs of vapor. Kyle led the way with the confident ease of someone who knew these trails intimately, but he frequently looked back to check on Sarah's condition and to make sure she was keeping up with the pace he had set. "How much farther?" Sarah asked during one of their brief rest stops, her voice breathless from the altitude and the effort of staying mounted despite her pregnancy. The baby had been active all morning, responding to the motion of the horse with kicks and movements that sometimes took her breath away. "About halfway," Kyle replied, offering her a drink from his water bottle. "The trail gets steeper from here, but it's also more sheltered. We should be able to make good time if the weather holds. They had been riding for perhaps 3 hours when Kyle suddenly raised his hand, signaling for her to stop. His head was tilted slightly, listening to something that Sarah couldn't hear over the sound of her own labored breathing and the gentle snorting of the horses. "What is it?" she whispered, fear immediately flooding through her as she imagined their pursuers catching up with them on this isolated mountain trail. "Riders," Kyle said quietly, his hand moving to rest on the rifle that hung from his saddle. "Coming up fast behind us." He looked around quickly, taking in the terrain with the practiced eye of someone accustomed to finding defensive positions. "There's a stand of rocks up ahead where we can take cover. Can you make it that far?" Sarah nodded, though her heart was hammering so hard she was afraid it might burst. Kyle led them off the main trail and into a cluster of large boulders that provided both concealment and protection from anyone approaching from below. He helped her dismount and positioned her behind the largest rock, then took up a position where he could watch the trail they had just left. The sound of approaching horses grew louder, and soon Sarah could make out the voices of the riders as they called to each other across the mountain stillness. She recognized the harsh tones of the men from the trading post, and her blood turned to ice as she realized how close they had come to being caught in the open. "Tracks lead this way," one of the men was saying, his voice carrying clearly in the thin air. "Fresh ones, too. Can't be more than an hour ahead of us." "Good," came the reply, and Sarah recognized the voice of the leader who had gripped her wrist so painfully. "The woman's slowing them down. We'll catch up with them before they reach wherever they're heading." Kyle's jaw tightened as he listened to their conversation, his grip shifting on his rifle as he prepared for the confrontation that seemed inevitable. Sarah could see the determination in his face, the grim acceptance of a man who had made his choice and would see it through regardless of the consequences. The riders passed by their hiding place without stopping, following the main trail deeper into the mountains. Kyle waited until the sound of their horses had faded completely before emerging from behind his rock, his expression thoughtful as he considered their options. "They're following our tracks," he said quietly, "but they don't know about the cabin or where we're really heading. If we can get there before they figure out they've lost the trail, we might be able to stay ahead of them." "What if they find us?" Sarah asked, voicing the fear that had been growing in her chest since they had first heard the approaching riders. Kyle's expression was grim but determined. "Then we'll deal with that when it happens. But right now, our best chance is to keep moving and hope we can reach the cabin before they realize they've been following a false trail." They remounted their horses and continued their journey, but now there was an urgency to their pace that hadn't been there before. Kyle led them off the main trail and onto a narrow path that wound through dense stands of evergreens, their branches heavy with snow that occasionally dumped its burden on the riders below. The baby seemed to sense Sarah's increased anxiety, responding with movements that were more frequent and uncomfortable than before. She found herself gripping the saddle horn with white knuckles, trying to maintain her balance while dealing with the growing discomfort in her back and abdomen. "Not much farther now," Kyle called back to her, though she could hear the concern in his voice as he noticed her obvious distress. "Just over that ridge and we'll be there." As they crested the final hill, Sarah saw their destination spread out below them like something from a dream. The cabin was larger than she had expected, built of sturdy logs and nestled in a protected valley that was surrounded by towering peaks. Smoke rose from its chimney, indicating that Kyle had arranged for it to be prepared for their arrival, and she could see a well-stocked woodpile and other signs of careful preparation. "It's beautiful," she breathed, feeling a sense of relief and safety that she hadn't experienced in weeks. But even as they descended toward the cabin, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that their troubles were far from over. The men pursuing them were determined and resourceful, and she doubted that a single false trail would be enough to throw them off permanently. As Kyle helped her down from her horse and led her toward the warmth and shelter of their refuge, she could only hope that they would have enough time to prepare for the confrontation that seemed inevitable. The interior of the cabin exceeded Sarah's expectations in every way, revealing itself to be not just a simple shelter, but a carefully planned refuge designed for extended habitation. The main room was spacious and warm, dominated by a large stone fireplace that radiated heat throughout the space. Shelves lined the walls stocked with books, supplies, in provisions that spoke of meticulous preparation. A comfortable bed occupied one corner, piled high with thick quilts and furs, while a sturdy table and chairs provided space for meals and other activities. "This is incredible," Sarah said, turning slowly to take in all the details. "How long have you been preparing this place?" Kyle was busy securing the door and checking the windows, his movements efficient and purposeful as he went through what was clearly a well-practiced routine. "A few years now," he replied without looking up from his work. "I always figured I might need a place to disappear to someday, somewhere I could wait out trouble or just get away from the world for a while." Sarah settled herself carefully into one of the chairs near the fire, grateful to be off her feet after the long and difficult ride. The baby had finally quieted, apparently soothed by the warmth and stability of their new surroundings. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to relax slightly, though she remained acutely aware of the danger that still lurked somewhere in the mountains behind them. "What happens now?" she asked, watching as Kyle continued his methodical inspection of their defenses. "Do you think those men will find us here?" Kyle paused in his work, his expression thoughtful as he considered the question. "Eventually, maybe, but this place is well hidden, and there are several false trails that might keep them busy for a while. The bigger concern is what happens when winter really sets in. Once the heavy snows start, no one will be able to get up here until spring." The implications of his words settled over Sarah like a weight. She would be trapped in this cabin with a man she barely knew, completely dependent on his protection and goodwill, with no possibility of escape or rescue if things went wrong. But as she looked around at the comfortable surroundings and felt the warmth of the fire on her face, she realized that she felt safer here than she had anywhere since learning the truth about James. "I want you to know how grateful I am," she said quietly, "not just for bringing me here, but for everything you've done. I know you're taking a terrible risk by helping me." Kyle finally finished his inspection and joined her at the table, pouring himself a cup of coffee from the pot that had been keeping warm on the stove. "We all take risks," he said simply. "The question is whether they're worth taking. In your case, I believe they are." They spent the rest of the day settling into the cabin and establishing the routines that would govern their lives for the months ahead. Kyle showed Sarah where everything was stored, from the medical supplies that might be needed when her baby arrived to the weapons cache that would be their last line of defense if their pursuers managed to find them. He was thorough and patient in his explanations, treating her as a partner rather than a helpless burden. As evening approached, Sarah found herself helping to prepare their dinner, grateful to have something useful to do with her hands. The simple act of cooking in a real kitchen, even one as rustic as the cabins, reminded her of happier times when her biggest concern had been what to serve for supper. But those memories felt like they belonged to someone else, a different woman who had lived a different life in a world that no longer existed. "Tell me about your sister," she said as they sat down to eat, hoping to learn more about the tragedy that had shaped Kyle into the kind of man who would risk everything for a stranger. Kyle was quiet for a long moment, his fork pausing halfway to his mouth as he considered her request. "Her name was Maria," he said finally. "She was younger than me, barely 18 when she got herself into trouble with a man who promised her the world and then disappeared when she needed him most." Sarah felt a chill of recognition as she listened to his words, seeing uncomfortable parallels between Maria's story and her own situation. "What happened to her?" "She was too proud to come home, too ashamed to ask for help," Kyle continued, his voice heavy with old grief. "She tried to make it on her own, but winter came early that year, and she wasn't prepared for it. By the time I found her, it was too late." He set down his fork and stared into the fire, lost in memories that still had the power to cause him pain. "I'm sorry," Sarah whispered, reaching across the table to touch his hand gently. "That must have been terrible for you." Kyle's fingers closed around hers briefly before he pulled away, as if the contact was too much for him to bear. "I swore that day that I would never let something like that happen again, not if I could prevent it. When I saw you in that trading post facing those men alone and afraid, I knew I had to act." Sarah understood then that her presence in the cabin represented more than just an act of kindness on Kyle's part. In protecting her and her unborn child, he was trying to atone for his failure to save his sister, to find some measure of redemption in a second chance that fate had offered him. The knowledge made her feel both grateful and burdened, aware that she represented something precious and fragile that he was determined not to lose again. That night, as she lay in the comfortable bed while Kyle took the first watch by the window, Sarah felt the baby moving restlessly within her. She placed her hands on her belly, trying to soothe the child with gentle circular motions, and found herself wondering what kind of life awaited them both. Would they be able to remain hidden in this mountain refuge until the baby was born? Would Kyle's protection be enough to keep them safe from the men who were hunting them? And what would happen when spring finally arrived and the snows melted, opening the mountain passes once again? The questions had no easy answers, but as she drifted off to sleep, Sarah found herself feeling more hopeful than she had in weeks. Whatever the future might bring, she was no longer facing it alone. In Kyle Diaz, she had found not just a protector, but a man of honor who would stand by his word no matter what the cost. For now, that was enough. The first weeks in the cabin passed with surprising tranquility, establishing a rhythm of daily life that helped both Sarah and Kyle adjust to their unusual circumstances. Each morning began with Kyle checking the perimeter of their refuge, looking for signs of unwanted visitors, while Sarah prepared breakfast from their carefully rationed supplies. The routine was comforting in its predictability, providing a sense of normalcy in a situation that was anything but normal. Sarah found herself settling into domestic tasks with an ease that surprised her. She mended Kyle's clothes with careful stitches, organized their supplies to make the most efficient use of space, and gradually took over most of the cooking duties as her pregnancy progressed. The work gave her a sense of purpose and contribution that helped offset her feelings of helplessness and dependence. Kyle, for his part, proved to be an unexpectedly considerate companion. He was respectful of her privacy and condition, never making her feel uncomfortable or vulnerable despite their enforced intimacy. He carved a set of baby clothes from soft wood during the long evenings, his weathered hands surprisingly gentle as he worked on the tiny garments. The sight of this rough mountain man creating something so delicate and hopeful moved Sarah more than she cared to admit. "You don't have to do that," she said one evening as she watched him put the finishing touches on a small wooden rattle. "I mean, I appreciate it, but you've already done so much." Kyle looked up from his work, his dark eyes reflecting the firelight as he smiled. "A baby needs things," he said simply, "and we don't know what the spring will bring. Better to be prepared." His words carried an underlying sadness that Sarah had learned to recognize, the weight of old losses that colored everything he did. She wanted to reach out to him, to offer some comfort for the pain he carried, but she sensed that he wasn't ready for that kind of intimacy. Instead, she focused on her own preparations for the child that grew larger and more active with each passing day. The baby's movements had become a constant presence in her life, sometimes gentle flutters that made her smile, other times powerful kicks that took her breath away. Kyle had noticed her discomfort during the stronger episodes and had fashioned a cushioned chair that provided better support for her changing body. His thoughtfulness in such matters continued to surprise and touch her. "How much longer do you think?" he asked one morning as she struggled to rise from her chair, her hand pressed against her lower back, where a persistent ache had settled. "Another month, maybe 6 weeks," Sarah replied, though she was beginning to suspect it might be sooner than that. The baby seemed eager to make its entrance into the world, and her body was responding with increasing urgency to the changes taking place within her. "I hope the weather holds until then." Kyle nodded, his expression serious as he considered the implications. "We've got everything we need for the birth," he assured her. "Medical supplies, clean linens, hot water. I've even got some experience with difficult deliveries, though I'd rather not have to use it." Sarah didn't ask how he had acquired such experience, sensing that it was connected to the same tragic past that had driven him to help her. Instead, she focused on the reassurance his words provided, grateful to know that she wouldn't be facing childbirth entirely alone in this remote mountain cabin. It was during the 4th week of their stay that Kyle's vigilance finally paid off. Sarah was resting in the afternoon, her feet elevated to reduce the swelling that had become increasingly troublesome, when Kyle suddenly appeared at her side with a finger pressed to his lips in a gesture for silence. "They're here," he whispered, his voice barely audible even in the quiet cabin. "3 of them, maybe 4, moving up the valley from the south. Sarah's heart immediately began racing, sending a surge of adrenaline through her body that made the baby respond with vigorous kicks. She struggled to sit up, her mind immediately jumping to thoughts of escape or defense. But Kyle's gentle hand on her shoulder kept her in place. "Stay calm," he said quietly. "They haven't found the cabin yet, and they might not. The camouflage is good, and there are several other trails they might follow." He moved to the window and peered through a carefully concealed gap in the shutters, his body tense with alertness. "What if they do find us?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling, despite her efforts to remain composed. Kyle's expression was grim but determined as he turned back to her. "Then we'll deal with it. But right now, the most important thing is to stay quiet and let them pass by if they're going to." The next few hours were among the longest of Sarah's life. She remained in her chair, hardly daring to breathe, while Kyle maintained his watch at the window. Occasionally, he would signal for her to be especially quiet, indicating that the searchers were close enough to hear any sound from within the cabin. The baby seemed to sense the tension, responding with restless movements that sometimes made Sarah gasp despite her efforts to remain silent. As darkness began to fall, Kyle finally relaxed slightly, though he remained alert and watchful. "They've moved on," he said quietly, "followed the eastern trail toward the old mining camp. But they'll be back. This was just a scouting expedition." Sarah felt a mixture of relief and dread at his words. They had avoided discovery for now, but the reprieve was only temporary. Their pursuers knew they were in the area and would continue searching until they found what they were looking for. "How long do we have?" she asked, already knowing that the answer wouldn't be what she wanted to hear. Kyle was quiet for a long moment, his weathered face reflecting the gravity of their situation. "Not long, maybe a few days, a week at most. They'll search systematically now, checking every possible hiding place until they find us." "Then we need to leave," Sarah said, though the thought of traveling in her condition filled her with dread. "No," Kyle replied firmly. "In your condition, in this weather, we wouldn't make it a mile before they caught us. And even if we did manage to escape, where would we go? This is the most defensible position we're likely to find." Sarah understood the logic of his words, but the thought of being trapped in the cabin while armed men searched for them filled her with terror. She thought of her unborn child, innocent of any wrongdoing but destined to suffer for the sins of a father it would never know. The injustice of it all threatened to overwhelm her with despair. "What are we going to do?" she whispered, her hands moving protectively to her belly. Kyle's expression softened as he saw her distress, and he knelt beside her chair to take her hands in his. "We're going to survive this," he said with quiet conviction. "Both of you. I promise you that." The confrontation came 2 days later, just as the first light of dawn was breaking over the mountain peaks. Sarah was awakened by Kyle's urgent whisper, his hand gently shaking her shoulder as she struggled to emerge from the deep sleep that had become increasingly elusive as her pregnancy progressed. "They're here," he said quietly, his voice carrying the calm determination of a man who had been preparing for this moment. "4 of them, moving up from the creek bed. They found the cabin." Sarah's heart immediately began pounding as she struggled to sit up, her swollen belly making even simple movements difficult and awkward. The baby responded to her distress with vigorous kicks that took her breath away, as if sensing the danger that surrounded them. "What do we do?" she whispered, her voice barely audible even in the quiet cabin. Kyle was already moving, checking his weapons and positioning himself near the window where he could observe their approaching enemies. "You stay down, keep away from the windows, and no matter what happens, don't come out until I tell you it's safe." "Kyle, there are 4 of them," Sarah protested, fear for his safety overriding her own concerns. "You can't face them all alone." His smile was grim but reassuring as he turned back to her. "I've faced worse odds than this before. Besides, they want you alive, which gives me an advantage. They'll have to be careful about their shots, while I won't have any such restrictions." The sound of approaching footsteps crunched through the snow outside, and Kyle motioned for Sarah to move to the corner of the cabin that offered the most protection. She positioned herself behind the heavy wooden table, her heart hammering so loudly she was certain their enemies would be able to hear it. "We know you're in there," called a familiar voice from outside, the same man who had confronted her at the trading post. "We just want to talk to the woman. Send her out, and nobody has to get hurt." Kyle's response was to cock his rifle with a sound that carried clearly in the cold mountain air. "The lady's not interested in conversation," he called back. "I suggest you move along before this gets unpleasant." "You're outnumbered, friend," came the reply. 4 to 1 aren't good odds, especially when you've got a pregnant woman to worry about. Be smart about this." "I've always been better at math than most folks," Kyle responded, his voice carrying a note of dark humor. 4 men out in the open against 1 man in a fortified position. I like my chances just fine." Sarah could hear the men moving around the cabin, trying to find the best positions from which to launch their attack. The walls were thick and well built, but she knew they wouldn't stop a determined assault for very long. Her hands moved instinctively to her belly, trying to shield her unborn child from the violence that was about to erupt around them. The first shot came without warning, shattering the morning stillness and sending splinters flying from the wooden shutters. Kyle returned fire immediately, his rifle barking twice in rapid succession. Sarah heard a cry of pain from outside, indicating that at least one of his shots had found its mark. "That's one," Kyle muttered grimly, already reloading as more shots began to pepper the cabin from multiple directions. The battle that followed was unlike anything Sarah had ever experienced. The cabin filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder and the deafening roar of weapons being fired at close quarters. Kyle moved from window to window with fluid efficiency, returning fire whenever he had a clear target while conserving his ammunition for the shots that counted. Sarah pressed herself against the floor behind the table, her hands covering her ears as the violence raged around her. The baby was moving frantically within her, responding to her terror with movements that bordered on painful. She found herself praying desperately, not for herself, but for the innocent child who had no choice but to share in whatever fate awaited them. "2 down," Kyle called out grimly as another cry of pain echoed from outside. "How many more of you boys want to die for money that doesn't even exist?" The response was a renewed barrage of gunfire that shattered what remained of the windows and sent chunks of wood flying from the walls. But Sarah noticed that the volume of fire was definitely decreasing, indicating that Kyle's accurate shooting was taking its toll on their attackers. A sudden silence fell over the cabin, broken only by the sound of Sarah's labored breathing and the crackling of the fire that still burned in the hearth. Kyle remained motionless at his position by the window, his rifle ready as he scanned the area outside for any sign of movement. "I think we got them all," he said quietly, though he didn't relax his vigilance. "But we need to be sure before we let our guard down." It was then that Sarah felt the first sharp pain lance through her abdomen, different from the baby's movements and unmistakably urgent in its intensity. She gasped, her hand flying to her belly as she realized with growing horror that the stress and terror of the battle had triggered something that couldn't be stopped. "Kyle," she called out, her voice tight with pain and fear. "I think the baby's coming." He turned from the window immediately, his weathered face showing alarm as he took in her condition. "Now? Are you sure?" Another contraction hit her, stronger than the first, and Sarah doubled over with the intensity of it. "I'm sure," she managed to say through gritted teeth. "The baby's definitely coming." Kyle's expression shifted from warrior to protector in an instant, his rifle set aside as he moved to help her. "All right," he said, his voice calm despite the chaos that surrounded them. "We can handle this. Let's get you to the bed." As Kyle helped her across the cabin, Sarah caught sight of the scene outside through one of the broken windows. 3 bodies lay motionless in the snow, their blood creating dark stains against the pristine white. The 4th man was nowhere to be seen, and she hoped desperately that he had fled rather than simply found a better hiding place. But as another contraction gripped her, driving all other thoughts from her mind, Sarah realized that the immediate danger from their pursuers had become secondary to the new crisis unfolding within her own body. Her child was coming into the world in the midst of violence and chaos, and all she could do was trust in Kyle's promise to protect them both. The hours that followed blurred together in a haze of pain, exhaustion, and determination, as Sarah's body worked to bring new life into the world. Kyle proved to be as capable and gentle a midwife as he had been a defender, his weathered hands surprisingly tender as he helped her through each contraction. He had barricaded the broken windows and secured the cabin as best he could, but his primary focus remained on Sarah and the child she was struggling to deliver. "You're doing fine," he murmured encouragingly as another wave of pain gripped her. "The baby's almost here, just a little more." Sarah gritted her teeth and bore down with all her remaining strength, her body slick with perspiration, despite the cold air that seeped through the damaged walls. She had lost track of time, aware only of the rhythm of contractions and the urgent need to push that consumed her entire being. Somewhere in the back of her mind, she remained aware of the danger that might still lurk outside, but the immediate demands of childbirth pushed all other concerns aside. "I can see the head," Kyle said, his voice filled with wonder and excitement. "Just one more push, Sarah. One more, and your baby will be here." With a final, desperate effort that seemed to draw on reserves of strength she hadn't known she possessed, Sarah pushed with everything she had. She felt a sudden release, a sensation of emptiness and completion combined. And then the most beautiful sound she had ever heard filled the cabin. Her baby's cry was strong and indignant, a declaration of life that seemed to chase away all the darkness and violence that had preceded it. Kyle's hands were gentle but sure. As he cleared the infant's airways and wrapped the tiny form in clean blankets, his weathered face transformed by an expression of pure joy. "It's a girl," he announced, his voice thick with emotion as he placed the baby in Sarah's waiting arms. "A perfect, beautiful little girl." Sarah looked down at her daughter's face, taking in the tiny features that were already so distinct and individual. The baby's eyes were dark like her own, but there was something in the shape of her face that reminded Sarah painfully of James. For a moment, the weight of her child's heritage threatened to overwhelm her, the knowledge that this innocent life was connected to a man who had lived by violence and deception. But as she held her daughter close, feeling the warmth and weight of the tiny body against her chest, Sarah realized that the past no longer mattered. Whatever James had done, whatever crimes he had committed, this child was innocent of all of it. She was a new beginning, a chance for Sarah to build something good and pure from the ashes of her old life. "She's beautiful," Kyle said softly, his finger gently stroking the baby's cheek. "What will you call her?" Sarah considered the question, thinking of all the names she had contemplated during the long months of pregnancy. None of them seemed right now, not after everything they had been through to bring this child safely into the world. But as she looked at Kyle's face, seeing the tenderness and protectiveness there, she knew exactly what her daughter's name should be. "Hope," she said quietly. "Her name is Hope." Kyle's smile was radiant as he nodded his approval. "Hope it is. It's perfect." As Sarah nursed her daughter for the first time, marveling at the instinctive way the baby latched on and began to feed, Kyle moved quietly around the cabin, cleaning up the evidence of the birth and checking once more on their defenses. The violence of the morning seemed like something from another lifetime, pushed aside by the miracle of new life that had just occurred. "What happens now?" Sarah asked as Hope finally settled into sleep, her tiny fist curled against her mother's breast. Kyle settled into the chair beside the bed, his rifle within easy reach, but his attention focused entirely on the woman and child before him. "Now we wait for spring," he said simply. "We let you recover from the birth, we make sure little Hope grows strong and healthy, and we figure out what kind of future we want to build together." The word "together" hung in the air between them, carrying implications that neither of them was quite ready to address directly. But Sarah felt a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the fire in the hearth, a sense of belonging and safety that she had never expected to find again. "I don't even know how to thank you," she said, her voice soft with exhaustion and gratitude. "You've given us everything, our lives, our freedom, a chance for Hope to grow up safe and loved." Kyle's expression grew serious as he leaned forward in his chair. "You don't need to thank me, Sarah. Taking care of you and Hope isn't a burden or a duty. It's a privilege." He paused, seeming to struggle with words that didn't come easily to him. "I know this isn't the life you planned, and I know I'm not the man you would have chosen to share it with. But if you're willing, I'd like to be part of Hope's life, part of both your lives." Sarah looked at this man who had risked everything to protect her, who had delivered her child with gentle hands and defended them both with deadly skill. She thought of the long winter months they had spent together, learning to trust and depend on each other in ways she had never imagined possible. And she realized that somewhere along the way, Her feelings for Kyle had grown into something deeper and more complex than simple gratitude. "I can't think of anyone I'd rather have as part of our lives," she said honestly. "Hope is going to need a father figure, someone strong and good to look up to. And she paused, gathering her courage to speak the words that had been growing in her heart. "I think I'm falling in love with you, Kyle Diaz." His smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains, transforming his weathered features with a joy that made him look years younger. "I've been in love with you for weeks," he admitted. "I just didn't think I had the right to say so. Not when you were so vulnerable and dependent on my protection." As Hope slept peacefully in her mother's arms, Sarah and Kyle began to talk about the future they might build together. They spoke of spring and the choices it would bring, of names and identities that could be left behind, of the family they were already becoming in the shelter of their mountain refuge. Outside, the snow continued to fall, sealing them away from the world and its dangers for the remainder of the long winter. But inside the cabin, three souls had found something precious and rare: a love born from adversity, a family forged in the crucible of survival, and a hope that burned as bright and warm as the fire that would keep them safe until spring returned to the mountains. Spring arrived in the mountains with a gradual warming that transformed their world from the stark beauty of winter into something vibrant and alive with possibility. Sarah stood at the window of the cabin, Hope cradled in her arms, watching as Kyle worked in the small garden he had planted behind their home. The baby had grown strong and healthy during the winter months, her dark eyes bright with intelligence as she took in everything around her with the curiosity of a child discovering the world. The past months had been a time of healing and growth for all of them. Sarah had recovered fully from Hope's birth, her body regaining its strength, while her heart learned to trust in the love that had blossomed between her and Kyle. They had married in a simple ceremony performed by Kyle himself, using his authority as a former territorial judge to make their union legal and binding. The irony that she had once again married a man with a hidden past was not lost on her, but Kyle's secrets were ones of service and sacrifice rather than crime and deception. "She's getting so big," Kyle said as he entered the cabin, his hands still dirty from working in the soil. He had removed his shirt in the warming sun, and Sarah couldn't help but admire the play of muscles across his chest and shoulders as he moved. The harsh lines that had marked his face during the winter had softened, replaced by an expression of contentment that made him look like a different man entirely. "She'll be walking before we know it," Sarah replied, shifting Hope to her other arm as the baby reached for Kyle with grasping fingers, "and talking and getting into all sorts of trouble." Kyle's laugh was rich and warm as he took his daughter into his arms, for that was how they both thought of Hope now. He had legally adopted her as part of their marriage ceremony, giving her his name and his protection for all the years to come. Whatever James Morrison's legacy might have been, it had no power over this child who would grow up knowing only love and security. "I've been thinking," Kyle said as he settled into his favorite chair with Hope on his lap, "about what we talked about last week, about leaving the mountains when summer comes." Sarah nodded, understanding the complexity of the decision they faced. The cabin had been their sanctuary and their home, the place where their love had grown and their family had been born. But it was also isolated and remote, cut off from the world in ways that might not be best for Hope as she grew older. "The territorial capital is growing fast," Kyle continued. "There would be opportunities there. Schools for Hope when she's older, other children for her to play with. I could set up a law practice, maybe even run for territorial judge again someday." "And what about the men who were looking for me?" Sarah asked, voicing the concern that still occasionally troubled her dreams. "What if someone recognizes me, connects me to James Morrison, and all those old crimes?" Kyle's expression grew serious as he considered her words. "James Morrison is dead, and so is his widow. The woman those men were hunting doesn't exist anymore." He reached out to take her hand, his fingers warm and reassuring as they intertwined with hers. "You're Sarah Diaz now, wife of Kyle Diaz and mother of Hope Diaz. You have a legal marriage certificate and a birth certificate for Hope that establishes her parentage beyond any doubt. The past can't touch you anymore." Sarah squeezed his hand, drawing strength from his certainty and confidence. She had learned to trust Kyle's judgment in all things, knowing that his experience and wisdom had kept them safe through the darkest times of their lives. If he believed they could build a new life in the territorial capital, then she was willing to take that leap of faith. "All right," she said finally, "let's do it. Let's leave the mountains and see what the world has to offer our daughter." Hope chose that moment to let out a delighted gurgle, as if she approved of the decision her parents had just made. Kyle lifted her high above his head, eliciting squeals of laughter that filled the cabin with joy and promise. As the weeks passed and they prepared for their departure, Sarah found herself reflecting on the incredible journey that had brought them to this point. A year ago, she had been a different person entirely, living a life built on lies and deception without even knowing it. The discovery of James's true nature had shattered that existence, forcing her to flee into the wilderness with nothing but the clothes on her back and the child growing within her. But from that destruction had come something beautiful and true. In Kyle, she had found not just a protector, but a partner, a man whose strength was matched by his gentleness and whose love was as steady and reliable as the mountains themselves. In Hope, she had discovered a purpose that transcended her own fears and uncertainties, a reason to be brave and strong and hopeful about the future. The day they finally left the cabin was bittersweet, filled with gratitude for the sanctuary it had provided and excitement for the adventures that lay ahead. Kyle loaded their belongings into a sturdy wagon, including the wooden toys he had carved for Hope during the long winter evenings and the carefully preserved letters and documents that established their new identities. As they drove away from the valley that had been their home, Sarah turned back for one last look at the cabin where so much of their story had unfolded. The building looked small and lonely against the backdrop of the towering peaks, but she knew it would always hold a special place in their hearts as the place where their family had truly begun. "No regrets?" Kyle asked, noticing her backward glance. Sarah shifted Hope to a more comfortable position in her arms and smiled at the man who had become her whole world. "None at all," she said firmly. "We're going home." The wagon rolled on through the mountain passes, carrying them toward a future bright with promise and possibility. Behind them, the peaks stood eternal and unchanging, keeping their secrets and sheltering the memories of a love that had been born in darkness and had grown to illuminate everything it touched. Ahead lay the world, with all its challenges and opportunities, waiting to welcome the family that had been forged in the crucible of survival and tempered by the unbreakable bonds of love. As Hope slept peacefully in her mother's arms and Kyle guided their wagon toward the distant settlements, Sarah felt a deep sense of completion and contentment. She had lost everything once, but in losing it had found something far more valuable. She had discovered that love could bloom in the most unlikely places, that strength could be found in the most desperate circumstances, and that sometimes the greatest gift life could offer was a second chance to build something beautiful from the ashes of what had come before. The mountain man had found a lonely pregnant woman on Christmas Eve, and the truth had indeed torn his soul apart. But from that tearing had come healing, and from that healing had come a love that would endure for all the years to come. In the end, that was the only truth that mattered, the only legacy worth leaving for the child who would grow up knowing that she was wanted, loved, and cherished beyond all measure. Their story was far from over. But as they descended from the mountains into the valley below, Sarah knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, as a family united by bonds that no force on earth could break. The future stretched out before them like an unwritten page, waiting to be filled with all the joy, love, and hope that three hearts could hold.